Hello and welcome to another installment of questions from viewers, and as the name implies, this is where you can submit a question here to the channel via speakpipe.com/hsg and potentially have it answered in its own standalone video, such as this one. And for this question, it's from a Discord OG and a regular. Many of you will recognize his name, of course, Tomsoft. So without any further ado, let's get straight into his question.
So, hello Mike, for the first question. I'm about to buy a first car, and as you know probably, I'm very, very young. So I have to decide on a car with maximum of 130 horsepower. What would you prefer for someone who is at the age of 18, 19 to buy as a first car?
So, there is the question. Very, very hotly debated thing among young people. Of course, you'll have your plans if you're in your maybe 16, 17 region of what you want to get. Maybe now you're 18, 19 and actually are in a position to save or have saved some money for a car. But insurance could sting you. Do you have parents who are going to give you some cash toward it, or do you need to earn it yourself? There are a number of factors which will play a role. Of course, where you live makes a big difference. Even within the UK, as an example, your insurance will be, for instance, much higher in a city centre like London than it would be in the countryside. So with all of those factors at play, there are kind of two overarching answers I would give. The first one is that you should probably just listen to your parents. And that's the sensible answer that I'm going to give, because your parents, if they are drivers at least, and if they have been driving for some time, well, they simply have experience, and experience is highly beneficial. They will have owned good cars, bad cars, and they'll have a pretty good idea, at least, even if they're not car fans per se, of what a good choice would be. However, you didn't ask your parents, you asked me, the guy who bought a twin-turbo 5-litre V10 as his first car, so of course my answer is going to be a little bit more out of the box. With that in mind though, much like the approach that I take to many of the vehicles which I've reviewed in Beards and Cars, where I like to review cars which are not overly expensive but really, really good value, you know, stuff like lower level Maseratis, Jag XKs, all these kind of hidden gem type vehicles. Well, there are three cars which I would recommend at least looking into, and of course there are way more options than these, but these are just to kind of put you in the mindset which I believe you should have. See, one of the problems that young people often fall into when they get in their first car, especially if you're on more of a budget, if insurance prices actually matter to you, if maybe your parents aren't helping you out cash-wise and you need to afford it yourself, well then you're going to need to find something which either goes down the fully sensible route, or in the case of this question, you want something with a bit more flair, something that might be quick, but even just in a general sense is something that you're more proud of, something that's cool as a first car, but not necessarily aiming too high. We're not talking about Ferraris here. So with that in mind, the first option is a Fiat, and in particular, it's easily my favourite Fiat, the Panda 100 HP. Now, my answer is going to primarily focus, I guess you could say, on the UK and Europe, but in some of the cases here, you could probably get your hands on some of these cars, at least in the States or, worldwide in general. The Panda 100 HP, though, is available in Europe, is available in the UK. In the UK, you're looking at like 2.5 to 4.5 grand, but it does fluctuate, much like my Touareg V10. It's becoming more of a unicorn, so expect the values to either stay where they are or go up a little bit, because it is such a good little car. Problematically, it is a petrol, it's a hot hatch, it is the top of the range Panda, which is a weird statement, but it's technically true. So expect it to maybe be a little bit more expensive than you might be hoping for, but if you could afford something like that, certainly look into it. They're not too expensive to buy, fuel economy is good, they're not overly large or cumbersome, parts aren't too expensive because it's a Fiat, and they are genuinely fantastic little cars. I haven't driven one yet, but just look up any number of car reviews and journalists, they pretty much all shower it with praise. The next option, though, is on the same vein, but this is probably the one which I would have actually gone for in my teen years instead of what I actually did, which is wait a little bit longer and get something crazy like a Touareg V10. That is Skoda. The beauty of modern Skodas, and when I say modern, we're talking in particular here the early 2000s sweet spot, is that they're just rebadged Volkswagens. As such, parts are not overly expensive, but you do have a healthy amount of German engineering and build quality, certainly compared to something Italian like a Fiat, but also there's a crucial sweet spot wherein the VRS models, the high-performance Skodas, were diesels exclusively. And that earlier 2000s Fabia and Octavia, in particular those two, depending on if you want the little hatchback or more of a sports sedan, they are similar in the UK at least in terms of their used values. Dirt cheap, in other words. They have 1.9 turbo diesel Volkswagen sourced engines, which sounds pretty big for a first car, but they only put out about 130 horses. The torque though is very good, because diesel, turbo. Fuel economy is fantastic, over 50 to the gallon if you drive sensibly. They're front wheel drive, fantastic through corners, and I happen to think they're just really cool looking little cars as well. Once again, like the Fiat, I haven't actually managed to get my hands on one yet. It's certainly on my to-do list for beards and cars, but I would be more surprised if I didn't like it, to be honest. Now, the beauty of these actually ties directly into the single biggest piece of advice which I have for younger people in this whole video. And that is what you need to master when it comes to looking up insurance quotes and finding out what the best possible car is that you can afford, is don't do what every other kid does. And I mean that very literally. That's the whole point. See, insurance companies don't care about you. They don't care if you're a good driver. They actually care more about your car than you. And what I mean by that is, they don't care how fast your car is, they don't really care how powerful it is, and they don't even care how big the engine is. What they really care about is that car's history. And when I say that car, I mean that model as a whole. See, if you compare, for example, an 18-year-old's insurance quote, at least in the UK, for something like a 1.4 Ford Fiesta to, for example, a 2-litre Mondeo diesel estate. A more powerful, bigger, faster car, which you could cause way more damage with in a crash, you might just find that the difference in quote is not as drastic as you might have thought. And the reason why is because kids don't buy diesel Mondeo estates. Older people do. That car's history is going to be associated with a higher average age with much lower average crash rates. And that is what they care about. See, your age doesn't really matter to an insurer. What matters is that car's history of risk. How likely is it that they're going to have to pay out because of the kind of clientele who typically drive that particular vehicle? So if you go for a Fiesta, well, the average age on something like that is going to be pretty low and the crash rate is going to be pretty high. So it's a high-risk vehicle, even if it's not an ST or an RS or anything like that. Whereas the bigger, less obvious choice, much like my Touareg V10 was, because how many young people do you know who buy those? Well, of course my insurance was better than it easily could have been because of its history. Now, I'm not saying you could necessarily get a V10 as your first car as a teenager. Depends on your income, I guess. But it highlights the point that I'm trying to make. Think outside the box. Don't think like a teenager, because that's what they expect you to do. Think like somebody who's already 25, 30, 35. What would you buy if you're looking for sensible and performance? Look down that route. That's how you end up with Skoda VRSs. And the next pick, and this is the one which would, I believe, also apply in the States, if I recall correctly, and that is a Jag. A Jaguar X-Type in particular, the dirt cheap model of the Jaguar range. Here in the UK, you can buy them for like $1,000 or less easily. You get a 128 horsepower, like I think it's a 2-litre diesel, something like that. Not exactly designed for high performance, but it's the out-of-the-box choice which would have really appealed to me as a teen, because it's certainly not the kind of car that a kid would ever buy. The history, because of having older drivers and more sensible clientele, is fantastic, super low crash rates, dirt cheap car, which is also really helpful on your quote because it means that if you do crash it, they're not going to have to pay you that much for it, which always helps. And if you get, some higher mileage vehicle with that diesel engine, it's a Ford underneath, it's basically a Mondeo, so parts aren't that expensive. It might not be the most reliable thing around, but again, it's just a beta, in fact, as your first car. It's not as hot as something like the Panda or the Skoda, but it's for those of you who, much like myself, even as a teenager, might want something that's a little bit less expected. Maybe a little bit more upmarket even. A Jag as your first car is kind of cool. Plus, you can even buy it as a wagon, which is very useful for nocturnal activities, which is another reason why I would have probably bought one. So ultimately, there are definitely options out there which are way more hot than you might have thought you could have as a first car, but they're at the very least worth looking into. And even if you don't get any of these three, I'm trying to give you the mindset that you need to have. These out-of-the-box, less obvious choices which fall between the cracks of the insurance. You don't see these cars everywhere, certainly not being driven by young people, and that is exactly what you need to be looking for. So that is my ultimate advice. As I said, the sensible option is just ask your parents. The option that I would go for is one of these. Ultimately, probably the Skoda, to be honest. I could have seen myself getting a Fabia VRS or maybe even the Octavia for the extra space, a nice yellow one maybe. But that's my advice. I may even talk about this subject again in future if you'd like to hear more. And of course, as I said, if you want to submit your own question for the series, go to speakpipe.com/HSG. But until next time, I'll see you then. And for now, as always, thanks for watching.